I grew up on an island in South Carolina. I loved to go to the beach when I was a child, but I didn't like going into the water. For one thing, I didn't know how to swim, and for another thing, I was knocked down more than once by waves, and I nearly drowned. I was little, you see, and didn't weigh much. I was saved by my sister once and by friends a couple of times later. I was pulled down by the waves and then pulled back up by people who cared about me. I'm glad I never went into the water alone. In the sentences I just used to tell you my story, I used both active and passive verbs. What are the differences? Well, I'll tell you. First, let's look at some charts so you can see the differences. Then I'll go back and show you the story I just told you, and we can see together which ones were active and which were passive. If you look at those two sentences, you'll see the difference between sentences in the active voice and sentences in the passive voice. Voice in grammar is about whether the subject of a sentence is doing the action or if the action is being done to the subject. It also works for stative verbs or verbs of being. The first sentence here, the one that is an active sentence, is big fish eat small fish. Here, the subject is fish, that is big fish. And it's the big fish that are doing the action of eating. What are they eating? They're eating small fish. So in this sentence, the subject is doing the action. It's an active sentence. In the other sentence, small fish is the subject, but these are the same fish. So you know that the big fish are still eating the small fish. The sentence is small fish are eaten by big fish. Small fish is the subject, but it's receiving the action of the verb. When this happens, we have to use a form of the verb be plus the past participle. That's what you see here. In this sentence, you have the phrase by big fish, and that tells you who is doing the action to the subject. We don't always use by to show who or what did the action. We could just say small fish are eaten. Before we look at the rules, let's look at how these passive sentences look in different verb tenses.
The passive can be any verb tense. It's especially common in present and past verb tenses. Here in the first column are sentences in the active voice, and in the second column, you'll see what they look like in the passive voice. The first one is in the simple present. People take lots of pictures here. The subject is people, and that's who's doing the action. If we put that in the passive voice, we get lots of pictures are taken here. See that be verb and the past participle? That's what they look like. This time, though, pictures is the subject. But you know that pictures aren't taking people. People are taking pictures. So pictures is the receiver of the action, not the doer. Let's look at one in the simple past. They saw a shark near the beach. They saw. That's the action. But in the passive, it's a shark was seen near the beach. Notice that I didn't say who saw the shark. That doesn't matter. The important thing is that there's a shark out there. Someone saw it. This sentence is in the passive because the shark isn't doing the seeing. Does that make sense? Here's one in the present progressive, or present continuous if you prefer that label. People aren't protecting the whales. And in the passive, the whales are not being protected. In the past progressive, they were washing elephants is an active sentence, and the elephants were being washed is passive. Okay, one more. This time it's going to be in the present perfect. I haven't walked the dog. I know there's really no action taking place, but still, walk is an action verb. And I'm still talking about the subject, I, so it's still an active sentence. The passive version would be, the dog hasn't been walked. At least I haven't walked him. Maybe someone else has. Okay, let's look at the rules. Rule number 1. In an active sentence, the subject performs the action of the verb. We call the subject the agent or the doer. An example is, The fisherman caught 10 bluefish. The fisherman is the subject and it's also the agent. In a passive sentence, the subject receives the action of the verb. As I mentioned before, sometimes by plus the agent comes after the verb at the end of the sentence to show who or what is performing the action. And sometimes we don't include it. It doesn't matter who or what does the action. 10 bluefish were caught by the fisherman. Now the fisherman is the agent and 10 bluefish is the subject. Rule number 2. The passive occurs in different verb tenses. It always includes a form of be as an auxiliary verb plus the past participle form of the verb. You can tell which tense the sentence is in by noticing the form of the verb be. For example, the animals are being fed. That's present progressive. The research has not been completed. This one is in the present perfect. Has not been completed. And several new species of mushrooms were identified. This one is in the simple past. Okay, rule number 3. Only transitive verbs, these are verbs that take a direct object, can be used with the passive. Intransitive verbs, verbs that can't take a direct object, cannot be passive. Let's look at one transitive verb and one intransitive verb, and I'll show you what I mean. The verb discover is a transitive verb. You can discover something. So we can say, a new type of sea animal was discovered. This is in the passive. You don't have by and the agent in this sentence, but you know that the new sea animal isn't discovering anything. Someone discovered them. So you know this is passive. Well, what about the verb disappear? Can you disappear something? You can make something disappear, but you can't disappear something. So you know this verb must be intransitive. So we can't say, those birds are disappeared. That's incorrect. You would have to say, those birds disappeared. And that's not a passive sentence because the subject birds is also the agent or the thing that does the action. Are you with me? Let's look at the last rule. To make questions in the passive, put a form of the auxiliary be or have before the subject. The applications were completed would answer the question, were the applications completed? That's using the be verb. If you wanted to make this sentence, the animals have been trained into a question, it would be, have the animals been trained?
So when do we really use the passive? We usually use this when we're being more formal or when we don't want to tell you who or what is doing the action. We commonly use the passive in more formal situations, and the active is more common in informal situations. A formal sentence might be, not a great deal is known about the ocean floor. And an informal way to say that is, we don't know much about the ocean floor. So, what happens when we use the passive with modals? You know, words like would, could, should, can, may, that kind of word. Let me show you some information about that. Let's compare these sentences. The active one is, they should solve the problem. They might not be doing the action, they might not be solving the problem, but they is still the subject, even though we might not know who they are. The point is that in this case, they is the agent or the one who would be doing something if something is being done. Am I confusing you? I hope not. Let's put it this way. You know that the problem isn't solving they. It's the other way around. So this sentence is active. Now, if you look at the other one, the problem should be solved, you know this one has to be passive, again, because the problem can't solve anything. In both of these sentences, it's not really important who the agent is. It's important that this problem gets solved. When we use the passive with modals, we can look toward the future. So these are found in present, past, and future. Let's start off with present and future passives. To form the present and future passives, you have your modal or your modal plus not, and then the word be. You always have to get that be in there as an auxiliary verb in these present and future forms of the passive with a modal. It's always going to be the word be. And then you have the past participle. So in the present tense, one example sentence is, the schedule must be approved. Must is the modal, and then you have be and approved. Our future example is, the research might be done by next month. The only way we know this is the future is by the prepositional phrase at the end of the sentence, by next month. Here's another example of the future passive with a modal. The report won't be seen by the public. Remember that the contraction for will not is won't. Will is the modal we use for the future. So what happens when we need to use a modal in the passive that's talking about something in the past? Let's look. The form is very similar to the one we used for present and future passives with modals, except now we change the auxiliary verbs to have been instead of just be. So we have the modal plus have been plus the past participle. Our examples are, the money may have been taken, and she should not have been told the news. That's a long verb. Now let's look at the rules. There aren't many, only two. Rule number 1, the passive form with a modal is the modal plus be or be not, plus the past participle of the verb. This is in general. For example, the monkey can be trained. Is the monkey training someone? No, it's a passive sentence. Someone is training the monkey. How about this one? The elephant couldn't be moved. Are we talking about an elephant moving something? No, we're talking about moving the elephant, or the fact that we can't. Who can move an elephant? Okay, rule number 2. For passive sentences with the modal expressions be going to or have to, use either be going to plus be plus the past participle, or have to plus be plus the past participle. An example with be going to is, the work is going to be completed soon. Notice that this sentence has two be's in it, be going to, and just be before the past participle. The first be in be going to is conjugated because that's the informal future tense. You know, when you say I'm going to go to the store, that's am going to, so the first be is conjugated. Second one, the one before the past participle, is just the word be. Don't get confused with these. An example for the have to form is, the project has to be done now. The auxiliary verb have is conjugated, just like be was in the last sentence. The project has to be done now. Got it? If not, be sure to send me a comment or a question. I'll answer you.
Okay, maybe you're thinking, I got this, but when do I really use the passive? I'm glad you asked. Guess what? I have another chart. Yay, just what you want to see. Here it is. The passive can be used when you want to emphasize what happened more than who or what performed the action, the agent. For example, we can say, coffee is produced in Colombia. Who produced it? I don't know, some Colombians. Maybe I'm studying about where coffee is produced. If you give me a name, I might not know anything about that person. The name Juan Valdez comes to mind, but I don't even know if that's a real person. That's the name used in an old coffee TV commercial. I'm really more interested in knowing where the coffee is coming from. Actually, I love Colombian coffee that's medium roasted. Delicious. Okay, next rule is, the passive can also be used when you do not know the agent. That's kind of what I was talking about. I don't know who the agent is. Here's another example of this one. Look, the car has been stolen. If this has happened to me, I don't know who did it. If I know who stole it, I wouldn't have to call the police to report it. I'd just call the person who took it and say, hey, bring my car back. I would tell the police that my car has been stolen. Next rule, rule number 3. The passive is sometimes used when it is not necessary to state or repeat the agent. So if I say, my car was stolen, we know that a thief stole my car. We don't need to say, my car was stolen by a thief. We know that. The police know that. And the last rule is this: the passive can also be used to avoid criticizing or blaming someone. Here's an example of this kind of use. My manager told me in a nice way, this report was not done correctly. That's how a manager should point out a problem.
I want to talk to you a little bit about using by with a passive. You've seen that I sometimes use this and sometimes I don't. Guess what? I have more rules. Rule number one.
In a passive sentence, use by plus the agent when it's important to say who or what performed the action. For example, the tomatoes in his garden were destroyed by insects. I don't know about you, but I don't know any insects personally, so it's not going to matter to me which insects destroyed these tomatoes. Rule number two. Sometimes the agent is clear from the context, so you don't need by plus the agent. For example, Charles Dickens wrote many books. Oliver Twist was written in the 1830s. That's one of his most famous books. Since I was already talking about Charles Dickens, you know that I'm talking about his book. I don't need to say it was written by Charles Dickens. And the last rule: it is common to mention the agent in these three situations. When it's a number, like, this magazine is read by millions of people. When it's a person's name, like, the portrait was painted by Picasso. That would be very impressive. So you want to say who did the painting. And when the agent is someone or something specific, like, many animal habitats are threatened by pollution. We're not going to say many animal habitats are threatened by something. We want to know what is threatening animal habitats. It's pollution. Okay? That's that.
Now, there are a couple of other things I want to tell you about passives. These are more advanced, but I want to cover them in case you need to know about them. The first one is passive gerunds and passive infinitives. If you haven't watched my video about gerunds and infinitives, you might want to go back and watch those before you finish this video. Also, as a reminder, a gerund is a noun that looks like a verb with ing, and the infinitive is to plus the base form of the verb, but it's also used as a noun. The last thing I'll talk about is passives with the word get. So let's get started with gerunds and infinitives in the passive voice. Let's look at a comparison of these two. To make a passive gerund, we start out with not if it's in the negative, and then being, which is the gerund form of be, plus the past participle of the verb. Some sample sentences are, I dislike being given extra work. Don't we all at some time or another? I don't mind not being invited to the picnic. Do you know what it means to not mind something? It means it's okay with you. If you mind something, you do not want to do it. So if someone asks you, would you mind taking me to the store? And you would be happy to do that for your friend, you would answer, sure, I wouldn't mind at all. Okay, one more example. I was angry about being fired from my job. Passive infinitives work in a similar way. You still begin with not if it's a negative sentence, but then you add to be plus the past participle. Remember, to plus the base verb is an infinitive. Some examples: I want to be invited to the party. I tried not to be caught in the storm, and I was happy to be given my test scores. I guess I did well. Now let's look at the rules.
Rule number one. As we've seen already, the passive form of a gerund is being plus the past participle. Joe dislikes being asked a lot of questions, and Greg was upset about not being told the news. Rule number two. Like regular gerunds, passive gerunds can be the subject of a sentence, as in, being questioned about my work makes me nervous. They can also follow verbs such as avoid, dislike, mind, risk, and understand. Like, I don't mind being interviewed. and it can follow a preposition, as in, are you interested in being called if a job opens up? Remember, gerunds and infinitives look like verbs, but they act like nouns. Rule number 3. The passive form of an infinitive is not in the negative and then to be plus the past participle. For example, she is determined to be elected president, and the information is not to be discussed with anyone. Rule number 4. Passive infinitives can follow verbs and adjectives normally followed by a regular infinitive. Some common verbs that are followed by infinitives are ask, expect, hope, prefer, and wait. We waited to be picked up at the station. Some common adjectives that come before an infinitive are afraid, determined, lucky, and ready. I was lucky to be given the award.
Finally, I'm going to give you some information about using the word get with passives. There are only 2 rules you need to be concerned with, and I'm going to show those to you now.
You can use a form of get plus the past participle to create a passive meaning. Get passives are commonly used to describe something unwanted or unexpected. For example, his dog got hit by a car. He's very upset. Yes, that would upset anyone. They're also used to talk about something that will have a negative effect, such as, Kim is going to get punished for staying out too late. We can use these with certain verbs, such as accept, deliver, fire, that's the verb fire, hire, invite, offer, pay, promote, and show. I'm so happy I got accepted to the University of California, Fullerton. The second rule is the gerund form of a passive with get is getting plus the past participle, like I'm worried about getting fired. And the infinitive form of the passive with get is to get plus the past participle. For example, I don't expect to get fired.
I said I was going to get back with you on the first sentences that I said at the beginning of this lesson. So let's just quickly go through those and talk about passive and active. So the first one was, I grew up on an island in South Carolina. I is the subject, grew is the verb. This one is active. I grew. I loved to go to the beach when I was a child. Again, active. I loved. But I didn't like going in the water. Another active sentence. I did not like. That's active. I'm doing the liking or not. For one thing, I didn't know how to swim. Again, active. I didn't know. And for another thing, I was knocked down more than once by waves. This one is in the passive. I was knocked down. I didn't knock the waves down, they knocked me down. And I nearly drowned. This one is active. Now that sentence has 3 verbs, 2 of them are active, and 1 was passive. I was little, you see, and didn't weigh much. I was active. And I didn't weigh, active. It's because the subject is the one involved in being and weighing and action, which isn't really there. I was saved by my sister once. That one is in the passive. I didn't save her, she saved me. And by friends a couple of times later. Well, that's just a phrase. I was pulled down by the waves. That is passive. I was pulled down. And then pulled back up by people, again passive, who cared about me. I'm glad I never went in the water alone. I'm the one being glad, so this one's active. And that's all I said. So let's continue.
Okay, that's a lot of information about passives. Let's do a quick exercise to see if it all makes sense to you. We'll practice sentences from a couple of the charts. First, active and passive. I'll give you some sentences and you say if you think the sentence is in active voice or passive. Ready? Let's start. Are these sentences in the active voice or the passive voice? Number 1, Tom is opening the door. Is that active or passive? Who or what is doing the action in this sentence? Tom is, right? And what part does Tom play in this sentence? What is Tom? That's the subject. So this one is an active sentence because the subject is doing the action. Number 2, the teacher explained the lesson. What do you think? This one is also active because the subject teacher is doing the action. Number 3, Shakespeare wrote that play. Do you know? This one is also active. Shakespeare did the action of writing the play. Number 4, the cup fell to the floor. Do you know this one? Guess what? It's also active. And number 5, the village was destroyed by a tornado. What do you think? What's the subject? It's village. Did the village destroy anything? No, the tornado destroyed the village. So this one is in the passive because the subject, village, didn't do the action.
The next exercise is about passives with modals. Modals are auxiliary verbs that have a degree of certainty. They're not about facts. This time, I'll give you a sentence and some words, and you think about how we should add those words to the sentence. Should they be in active or passive?
The first one is Heather blank the news as soon as possible. We need to add should and the verb tell. Think about it a minute and pause the video if you need to. Do you have the answer? This one should be Heather should be told the news as soon as possible. I hope you got that one right. Number 2, I tried, but I blank the jar. Use couldn't and open. Do you have it? The answer is I tried, but I couldn't open the jar. Is it easy? Good. Number 3, the books blank to the library. Add have to and return. Be careful with this one. The answer is the books have to be returned to the library. Did you forget the be?
Okay, I think this lesson is long enough. If you're still with me, thank you very much. That's it for passives. There's a lot of information in this lesson, and I hope it's answered some of your questions about passives. If you still have questions, I hope you know how to get in touch with me. You can comment here or on my website at alexsesl.com. Sorry, alexseslworld.com. I have a special page just for asking me an English question. Feel free to use that. It will go right straight to my email address, and I promise I'll answer. For now, have a wonderful day, and remember to be kind to each other. See you next time.